Here, so just get online. Thank you for joining us. See people filling virtual lecture hall as we load here. Okay. All right. Good evening. Welcome everyone to the New York Studio School's virtual evening lecture series. We are very excited to be presenting Lowery Stokes Sims. Whose art history is it? Some thoughts on Robert Colescott. I want to thank all of you for joining us, taking the time to Zoom on this Wednesday evening. And I would like to thank Lowery for taking her time to join us and be part of our virtual lecture series this spring. I would also like to quickly recognize that the New York Studio School Evening Lecture Series is generously supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, and many individual contributors. Please do consider making a donation during or after tonight's talk by clicking on the support button on our homepage at www.nyss.org, and then just click on the donate button. This wouldn't be possible without individual contributions, so the Studio School is really grateful for anything. I'll introduce our speaker in one moment. Before I do, probably most people are familiar with all the Zoom functions by now, but at the bottom of your screen, you'll notice the chat button, which I already see a couple of hello Lowerys in there, and and the Q&A button. Please do feel free to enter a chat or a Q&A question at any time during the talk, and we'll leave time after the presentation to come back to those and then take more questions. All right. Tonight's speaker, Lowery Stokes Sims, is a specialist in modern and contemporary art, craft, and design, and is known for her particular interest in a diverse and inclusive global art world. Throughout her 5-decade career, she has supported artists whose identities and work reflect those values. Sims retired as curator emerita from the Museum of Arts and Design in 2015. She served on the education and curatorial staff at the Metropolitan Museum of Art from 1972 to 1999, and as executive director, president, and adjunct curator at the Studio Museum in Harlem from 2000 to 2007. She has recently served as a guest curator for exhibitions at the Caribbean Cultural Center African Diaspora Institute, Grounds for Sculpture, the Contemporary Craft Museum in Los Angeles, the Contemporary Arts Center in Cincinnati, and the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History and Culture. She was the 2018 Kurt Barnado Visiting Professor at the Institute of Fine Arts and Adjunct Professor at the IFA in 2019 and 2020. We are very, very excited to have, we're very excited to have Ms. Sims presenting tonight. So please join me in a virtual welcome for Lowery Stokes Sims.
Thank you, Sam. And thank you to Graham Nixon for this invitation. Now we're going to start sharing a little screen here. So, whose art history is it? Some thoughts on Robert Colescott. Some of you know that Robert Colescott has been a naughty obsession of mine for over 40 years. And I'm really thrilled to sort of like being able to sort of present some new ideas about his work this evening. I wanted to start off with these two images that mark the exhibition of watercolors by Colescott that just opened a few weeks ago at Blum and Poe Gallery in Los Angeles. It's entitled Robert's Complete History of World Art from the Pyramids in Egypt to the Modern Era. In this series, which was done in 1979, Colescott illustrates various styles of art and art historical periods And he does so using figures of women, and as is his wont, they're often scantily clad. But an exception, I thought, was this personification of postmodernism on the right, which seems to be a person that's weary of the onslaught of appropriation and exotic fantasies that accompanied her presence in Western art history. Throughout his career, spanning over 6 decades, Colescott served up images which art historian Sharon Patton once described as subversive appropriations. That is, Patton continues, Colescott used images from a wide range of sources, African art, advertising, cartoons, and his paintings were satirical commentaries on race and discrimination and artistic hierarchies. Colescott himself said on the matter, I think that the way I've appropriated paintings is subversive because my version puts into question the ownership of the idea. The fact that the original work can be redone questions its value. He continues, I think that if I make a painting that has a strong quality of irony and sass, if I push an idea so far that it's something that really sticks in people's minds, I've put a barrier between the viewer and the original work because when people see my demoiselles, they're going to think of mine when they see Picasso's. But Colescott's well-known appropriations certainly achieve that destabilization of ownership, but he's not concerned really with 1980s postmodern death of the author polemics. His intent and ambitions are no less than what he described as interjecting Black people into art history. We can see this in some of his well-known riffs on art historical masterpieces, including Natural Rhythm, Thank You, Jan van Eyck from 1976, Liberty Leading the People, also from 1976, and probably his best-known work, George Washington Carver, Crossing the Delaware, a page from American History Textbook from 1975. While on the face of it, these works are witty, naughty parodies, closer examination reveals his intention to challenge longstanding taboos around racial stereotyping while forging new unexplored social meanings for those familiar compositions. The problem is that his chosen mode of figuration often sabotages our comprehension of his most serious intentions. So I realized in considering this work in the context of the current conditions that we find ourselves in the world, Colescott would seem to be an unlikely agent of change or protest. As I mentioned, his approach to figuration, bawdy, sharply expressionistic, rather than photo-referent and noble, and his often sly, irreverent attitude towards cherished traditions and soothing platitudes and exclusivistic national views would seem to make him more a disruptive renegade. We want our gender, race, preference, ableist messages more noble in appearance, more graphic in its depiction of lack or neglect, and certainly more seriously dogmatic. But Colescott is ever the gesture, and definitely an agent provocateur, who makes us reach within ourselves and reckon with our most secret thoughts, attitudes, and beliefs, and sometimes afterwards makes us laugh. And that's the big oops. Art historian Richard Powell described this strategy in an article recently published on ArtNet's website as going there. He elaborates on the use of satire to, quote, expose the perceived failings and shortcomings of individuals, institutions, or social groups. In doing so, he notes that a satirist might employ invective, sarcasm, burlesque, irony, mockery, teasing, parody, exaggeration, understatement, or stereotype in a discursive presentation, all to hold his or her predetermined target up to extreme ridicule and scorn. So as Colescott's satire has effectively snatched the exclusivity on the versions of those stories away from the original painters and their patronage that supported them and replaced them with his own, They certainly blow open narratives about our world and where and how we exist in it. So towards that end, I'd like to look at an aspect of his work that vividly demonstrates how Colescott made art history his own. It's an aspect of his work that has not been thoroughly examined, and that is his relationship to pop art. This presentation is based on research and writing I'm doing for an upcoming publication on pop art edited by Mona Hadla and Calliope Miniodaki. Now, given our association of a rather bawdy, expressionistic style with Robert Colescott that seems clearly allied with aspects of Bay Area figurationists such as Joan Brown or the inimitable funk sensibility of R. Crumb, it was interesting that Art Forum International noted upon his passing in 2009 that his imagery shared aspects with pop art, but they added the caveat he disdained its coolness. This gave one pause to think. But then, of course, when you look at it, his deployment of advertising, brand identification, and commercial commodities and popular cartooning, particularly in the 1970s, demonstrated what Michael Lobel described as a simultaneous proximity to and distance from pop art. This is amply demonstrated if we look at Colescott's contemporaneous appropriation of Roy Lichtenstein's 1991 wooden screen print, The Living Room, from his Interior series. Colescott did two versions of Interior homage to Roy Lichtenstein. In version 1, he inserted the figure of a Black man, and we see here version 2, where a Black woman lounges casually in a pink bra and panties in the interior depicted in the original Lichtenstein print. The man enjoys a beverage with one foot on the coffee tables, dressed in a sleeveless white-brown shirt and brown pants. And at first, their insertion into the Lichtenstein image is curiously jarring. There are some who would think that they were interlopers acting inappropriately in Lichtenstein's pristine interior, but there's no logical reason why they shouldn't be there, because after all, in the 1990s, there was a presence of a growing affluent class among African Americans, so that's not such a strange idea. But as Michael Lobel points out, quote, through his alterations to the image, Colescott forces us to see the literal, but also figurative, read racialized whiteness on which the coolness and the detachment of Lichtenstein's image, and by extension that of pop in general, depends. In retrospect, we find that associations of pop art with Colescott's work goes back to the 1970s, when critic John Perot described his 1975 exhibition at Razor Gallery in New York as, quote, outrageous Black pop. Pop art associations also came up when paintings such as George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware were included in the 1978 Art About Art exhibition curated by Jean Lippman and Richard Marshall at the Whitney Museum. In his review of the exhibition, Hilton Kramer noted that the work demonstrated, quote, the special strategies of neo-Dadaism, pop art, and their satellite styles. What this means is that the prevailing spirit of the exhibition is the spirit of irony. More often than not, this irony takes the form of parody, both the parody of actual works of art and parodies of commercial and pedagogical representations of it. So again, referencing Richard Powell's analysis, you couldn't find a more apt description of Colescott's own strategy using irony, satire, humor, and parody as he pursued his goal of putting Black people into art history. So if we think about it and we postulate, if Dada is a source of pop, then perhaps we could say that Colescott earned his pop art bona fides with his 1973 drawing, Homage to Duchamp. This image is a literal reinterpretation of Marcel Duchamp's iconic 1915 to 23 masterpiece, The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Even, or The Large Glass. But what William Rubin described as, quote, the intricate amatory iconography of the Duchamp, Here becomes a little transcription of this title. Colescott presents a demure nude woman wearing only a veil, stockings, high heels, and a strategically held bouquet surrounded by 3 expectant men. We sense no resistance or dismay on the part of the woman, and our reading of the image may very well reflect what art historian Jody E. Cutler describes as our own, quote, private thoughts on the sexual act depicted. Another example of Colescott's flirtation with Dada can be seen in The Green Glove Rapist of 1971. Colescott's attraction to popular entertainment forms from newspaper cartoons, movies, crime magazines, and detective stories, analyzed by Cutler and art historian Matthew Wesley, is in full evidence here. And it seemed to me that it resonated with The Menace Assassin from 1927 by the Belgian surrealist master René Magritte, which is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. Now, those of us who've had classes on surrealism know that the Magritte reflects his own avid interest in pre-World War I popular crime fiction series such as Fantomas. Here, on the left, he has created an enigmatic composition in which we see 3 men looking through a window into a room that is the scene of a murder. A nude female victim lies on a red cushioned settee, a cloth at her throat and blood running out of her mouth, while her presumed killer, a formally suited young man, pensively listens to the record playing on the gramophone. His suitcase on the floor, his hat and coat flung onto the chair, suggest a planned escape, but it is not to be. 2 detectives flank the entrance to the room. One holds a cudgel and the other a net, and they are poised to apprehend the perpetrator once he exits the room. Now, in Colescott's Green Glove Rapist, elements of the composition reflect that of the Magritte. You have the open window at the center of the composition. You have a female reclining in a bed. You have an open entrance to the room. Here it's not in the middle, but to the right of the composition. And you have a detective waiting on the other side of the door. Instead of being in the room already, the potential perpetrator, wearing green gloves, leans into the window while espying the woman who lays seductively on the bed, seemingly asleep in a flimsy red camisole, her discarded pink girdle on the bed. As opposed to Magritte's disquietingly orderly composition, where each action has a discrete space, Colescott has created a densely crowded space where a number of interactions interconnect. What the perp doesn't realize is that the woman is a police decoy. Her uniform with a badge hangs on the chair by the side of her bed, and she holds a pistol in her hand outside the sight of the would-be rapist. It is her male colleague in a hat and trench coat who stands in wait on the other side of the door, his own pistol drawn in anticipation of apprehending their prey. A stenciled caption at the top of the painting reads, "The Green Glove Rapist Trapped by a Police Decoy." It's interesting how Colescott plays with our presumptions about the theoretical construct of the gaze. He sets up a gaze within a gaze situation, from the male detective to the potential rapist to the woman who looks towards the window with one eye open to us, the viewers, who are therefore implicated in the scene. Without a doubt, Colescott had gendered approaches to women, being a man of a certain age who was creating his work in a specific era of American culture. If the 1960s and 70s was marked by the generation of love, the jettisoning of sexual taboos, and the concurrent women's movement, Colescott work sometimes can be said to reflect the accompanying ambivalence, confusion, and even hostility of men as they navigated this new sexual landscape. These scenarios exemplify what Cecile Whiting describes as aspects of, quote, femininity and domesticity in pop art, which existed, quote, despite the overwhelming privileging of male artists. Whiting singles out Tom Wesselmann's images from the early 1960s as revealing, quote, an economy of domesticity characterized by the increased number of goods and services marketed to the female consumer and homemaker after the Second World War, as observed in the private sanctums of the home, the bathroom, and the bedroom. And speaking of the sanctum of the bedroom, we can take a look at Wesselmann's Bathtub Collage #3 from 1963 and Colescott's Susanna and the Elders Novelty Hotel of 1980. The similarities are intriguing, the differences striking. The Wesselmann features a woman standing in a tub, drying her back with a towel. The artist lavishes unexpected detail on the decor. On the other hand, the figure is largely anonymous and indistinguishable, save her coiffed hair and her pubic area. She's ensnared within those trappings of prosperity, where she has no real role except to be on display for the delectation of the male viewer. But the decor within which she stands, toweling off herself, is one of a prosperous abode with a pristine fixtures and furnishings. In his painting, Colescott embraces the venality of the situation. He styles it as a reinterpretation of the Old Testament tale of a woman falsely accused of seduction. While the Susanna of the Bible rebuffs the men who spy on her at her bath and is later vilified for rejecting their advances, Colescott's Susanna primps provocatively before a Black janitor and an elderly white man dressed ready for bed and fun. She uses the semi-transparency of the shower curtain to tease the men who are now the seduced rather than the seducers. Also, as opposed to the woman in the Wesselmann or her archetype in the Bible, Susanna here is a woman in charge of her sexuality and fully aware of being observed. She turns seductively away from her audience with an over-the-shoulder glance. As suggested by the subtitle of the painting, Novelty Hotel, you can see its brand name on the bath mat. This is not the staid middle-class abode of the Wesselmann, but the basement accommodations of a seedy hotel, and the artist himself is seen peeking in on the scene from the window on the upper left. So while he was better known in the 1970s for his historically based deconstructions, Colescott also devised cheeky reinterpretations of imagery created to promote American consumer products. In addition to Kentucky Fried Chicken and Aunt Jemima pancake mix, he took on Franco-American spaghetti, Mother's old-fashioned root beer, as well as cigarettes and cigars. And interestingly enough, just as the ban on smoking ads started to being reinforced in the early 1970s. We can start by recalling Cecile Whiting's analysis of female femininity and domesticity in pop art. But Colescott pushes this idea further to remind us how domesticity played out in the lives of Black women who have both dominated the domestic arena and been exploited as household workers in a system that was clearly a holdover from slavery. To this end, he deploys two potent commercial entities, Aunt Jemima and Colonel Saunders. The pairing of Colonel Saunders and Aunt Jemima in 3 paintings from 1972 allows Colescott to remix his historical sources. Aunt Jemima was a fictional character, first enacted by Nancy Green, who you see here on the left, and created to brand a ready mixed self-rising flour for Pearl Milling Company starting in the 1890s. And, quote, Colonel Harlan Sanders was an entrepreneur who finalized his fried chicken recipe for public consumption in the 1940s. So here are 2 of those paintings. On the left, you see Instant Chicken, which presents a scene in the kitchen of a restaurant. And at the top of the composition, we see Colonel Saunders and a white maitre d'. The other characters are Black cooks, and Aunt Jemima is seen at the lower left in a blue and white dress with a red apron and red head rag. We should note elements that are quintessentially Colescott. In addition to the title emblazoned on the top, he provides stencil indicators for the characters. So you see the maitre d', the Colonel, Jemima, and the kitchen workers are identified by name as Junior Jackson, who's standing next to the maitre d', and Sonny Washington, who's at the lower right. So in this way that he provides credit for the kitchen staff, which often would belie the front room presence that is conveyed by the maitre d'. We also know, and should take note, I'm not sure how to interpret this, that Jemima is in a subordinate position in the composition at the lower left, while the scene is dominated by and presided over by Colonel Saunders and the maitre d'. Now, topless chicken it's just ridiculous. It takes the metaphorical possibilities of chicken parts over the top. In a fried chicken franchise, which is identified as Kentucky Fried Chicken, a drably attired couple clutch their red striped box and bucket as a blonde woman who's nude with large thrusting breasts, wearing only a red apron and high heels, rings up their order. And it's interesting because the more I look at the husband in this couple with his mustache and glasses, I suspect more and more that is Colescott himself. At the lower right, an extraordinarily nude Black woman wearing red panties and a white tie that mirrors the black tie of the Colonel, who stands by her, presents a box of fried chicken to the viewer, and an anonymous Black porter sweeps up at the right. The caption at the lower right reads, "Another breakthrough for the Colonel." So it's interesting that in these paintings, it's the Colonel who holds all the power, and the Black women, whether explicitly identified as Aunt Jemima or not, have scant attention paid to their own product lines. This implied power struggle becomes more explicit in Jemima's pancakes. Colonel Sanders is seen sexually accosting Jemima as she protests, "I can't dance, Colonel," and he asserts, "Don't hurt none." The encounter is witnessed rather passively by 3 Black children around a table of pancakes, syrup, and fried chicken. The younger boy comments, "No shit." The presence of the pancakes and syrup and the box of mix with Aunt Jemima's image is Colescott's way of directly addressing the consumerist exploitation and the preparation of a stereotype. In these paintings, Colescott can be said to direct the pop art dialogue to family-oriented spaces of the suburban kitchen, where the matrices of race and class intensify the dialogue around gender. Colescott's analysis of the power dynamics is, in this particular painting, is unexpectedly disturbing, and by proxy strikes a chord about the exploitation of women in other compositions associated with pop art. So I think it's interesting that we can step back here and note something that's happening right at this moment. In light of the ongoing controversy about the presentation of the Aunt Jemima character on a variety of products, it was interesting to note that in a posting on Fortune magazine's site on February 11th, just a few days ago, 2021, there's a notice that, quote, "After examining hundreds of names, PepsiCo yesterday announced that it was rebranding Aunt Jemima as Pearl Milling Company, the name of the enterprise founded in 1988, which originated the self-rising pancake mix that would later become known as Aunt Jemima." Christian Kropfel, Chief Marketing Officer for Quaker Foods North America, told Fortune that the new name reflects the dignity, the respect, and the warmth that we stand for. But it also appears to have been the safe choice, says Josh Gerben, an attorney specializing in trademark law. There is no potential controversy with this name. But fear not, Aunt Jemima somehow gets her revenge when she stars in Colescott's 1978 appropriation of William de Kooning's Woman One from 1952 to 53. This is one of the icons of abstract expressionism, and I get a thrill too when I see de Koo replaces the grimacing figure of the de Kooning with a mischievously smiling avatar of Aunt Jemima. But this is interesting enough, this painting is actually a riff off of a pop art riff I get a thrill when I see Bill by Mel Ramos, where in successive versions, Ramos replaces the head of the woman in the de Kooning with headshots of contemporary 1970s models. So Colescott navigates a path from the gestural distortion of de Kooning through the pop art glamorized version by Ramos, so that his Aunt Jemima acquires the sexual gloss of the Ramos, even as Colescott circles back technically to the gestural figuration of the de Kooning and the 1950s and 60s figural trends from which he has developed. So here we have Andy Warhol's Coca-Cola, green Coca-Cola bottles from 1960, and Colescott's Mom's Old Fashioned Root Beer from 1973. Now, we all know the Warhol features repetitive stenciling of green images of the Coca-Cola bottle with some variations in color in 7 registers with the distinctive red script logo at the bottom of the composition. As noted on the Whitney Museum website, the gist of this image is to convey the bulimia of mass production, the streamlined design of consumerist ideas, and the surface values of America's media-saturated post-war culture. As quoted in Sarah Uris Green's Andy Warhol Enterprise, Warhol himself observes, quote, "What is great about this country is that America started the tradition where the richest consumers buy essentially the same things as the poorest." The Colescott features mugs of foaming root beer in a scenario where they are meal props for a bespectacled white-haired mom convorting seductively and rather explicitly for dad. And there are several drawings that sort of accompany this. And in one, it's a young Black boy. And again, it's another version of, dad that's sort of doing it. So as we can see from these images, Colescott is again playing off of the usual associations of maternal evocations in advertising and mansplaining the ultimate mental extension of popular media's propagandistic use of images and associations to sell products. He has effectively torpedoed the warm and fuzzy associations of a product presumably made from a mother's recipe. A more benign appropriation is his gathering of a Black son and daughter and mother at the dinner in Black Capitalism, African-American Spaghetti. Again, the product is a mere herald in the title sequence inserted at the top of the painting. Spaghetti is the dominant graphic element. Thus, the title and the captions transform a popularized Italian food in the United States, which, by the way, was actually created and popularized by a Frenchman in 1915, this is a great country, into an African-American commodity. The boy extols the product, declaring, "We eats it and we loves it." His sister declares, "It is soul food." And the mother assures us that there are at least 2 meatballs in every can. These declarations embroil us in issues around fast food, quantitative produce, ethnicity, and the reference to Black capitalism in the title responds to the brand slogan of Franco-American that declared, "Who can? Franco-American can." The implication is that eating this product will allow the consumers to achieve their wishes and goals. Once again, in comparison to the Warhol, the commodity becomes a prop in a narrative rather than an iconic object for contemplation. Now, as we move into looking at Colescott's relationship with pop art, we inevitably come to his deployment of the pinup as a means to convey some of his most interesting and political concerns. And I'm showing you the familiar Betty Grable pinup from 1943, and also a pinup done by Rolf Armstrong called The Winning Combination, that variously is dated 1942 or 46 and later reproduces a poster by Collectors Press. In her 2006 study, Pinup Girls, Feminism, Sexuality, Popular Culture, Maria Elena Buzak traces the evolution of the pinup from Hollywood publicity vehicle to an icon of conflicting visions of American female power and display, to a propagandistic image during World War II, intended to scintillate men with a visualization of what they were fighting for to emancipate. These are now provocative images of women that sort of work counterproductively as they entered the workforce as recruits to the war effort. Buzak records Robert Westbrook's observation that during World War II, pinups were part of national construction of women as icons of obligation, presenting themselves as the sort of women their men will be proud to protect. Such images accustom the larger public to those changes in gender roles, if only for the duration. So now we see Colescott's version of a winning combination. This all has special relevance for Colescott, who volunteered for the Army right after he graduated from high school and was deployed in 1944 and served in France. Colescott can be said to allude to the contradictory message of these images in his painting. He sources an image with the same title that shows a drum majorette brandishing a large American flag with flags of the Allied coalition at the end, created by, as I said, Rolf Armstrong. But Colescott strips the flag of his embellishments and depicts a majorette dressed in the usual gear, but wearing no pants or shorts. I wanted that one first. Colescott's Bye Bye Miss American Pie evokes the popular song by Don McLean, which casts aspersions on the notion of opportunity and advancement in American society, which has popularly been characterized as getting a slice of the American pie. So he places that slice of pie, the whole of which is suspended over the head of the female figure, as a fig leaf element. We can think at the same time of Wesselmann's 1963 Great American Nude 47, where the female figure has a similar focus on her pubic area with the emphatic triangle of her red bikini pants. Allusions to patriotic sentiments can be seen in the red, white, and blue elements and the arc of stars at the headboard of her circular bed. At the lower register of Colescott's presentation of a white blonde woman as a personification of the American dream, the Black soldier in camouflage at the bottom of the composition seems to fire his rifle aimlessly at some unseen target to the right. By contrast, the protagonist in Roy Lichtenstein's lithograph, Crack, from 1963, has her targets clearly in sight. Bolstered by Lichtenstein's adroit appropriations from graphic stories, she is unambiguous in her actions. So the question is, when we look at this figure in the Colescott, does this image encapsulate ideas of sexual as well as political and economic frustration on the part of Black men in America in general, and Colescott in particular? And especially in the context of racial politics of this country, it raises the question, why did Black men go abroad to fight? What did Black men go abroad to fight for? And if not, a slice of the American pie. So now we go back. Perhaps the earliest deployment of a brand name came in Colescott's 1970s Havana Corona, where a young Black woman in a red dress with a slit up the side displays an open box of cigars from Havana, then quite the forbidden commodity if one considered bringing them in from Cuba. Havana Corona became the compositional prototype of these compositions of the 1970s that figured a centralized female figure. They took on some of the aspect of the classical pinup, which could be observed both in Wesselmann's elemental versions and Ramos's intensely detailed ones. So what we see in Havana Corona is a kind of explication of the dynamics of race in the Latinx context, with its legacy of assimilation and mestizaje, or mixture, that often resulted in contradictory phenomena emotionally and psychologically. Colescott captures this by placing the disembodied hand of someone who's obviously a prosperous upper-class white man at the margins of the composition. The hand holds a cigar, the smoke from which morphs into a cloud element that in turn frames a floral crown hovering over the head of the centralized woman. A dandified mulatto man is suspended at the right, and to the lower left is a bubble in which we see a sexual encounter that would have produced this mixed race individual. So what Colescott is really sort of talking about here is, you're going to have to excuse me because I have misplaced the page. Here we go. Sorry. So again, Colescott creates a narrative that threatens to supplant the message of the brand. And this time it is one of economic and sexual exploitation, because I do remember stories that I heard from Cubans when I was doing research on Wilfredo Lam, that the best Cuban cigars were those that were rolled on the thighs of mulatto women. Not so in Mel Ramos's 1965 serigraph, Tobacco Rose Road, where an unashamedly nude woman sits on an outsized package of Philip Morris cigarettes, which is open with 5 cigarettes coming out towards the viewer as she leans in on another that displays the logo for the viewer. And we can wonder if Ramos is making a sly punning reference in his title to the 1932 novel Tobacco Road by Erskine Caldwell about white sharecroppers in Georgia. So here, as in advertising, sex sells the product, whereas in the Colescott, the product is the foundation for a narrative about race and gender. Now, among these singular female apparitions of the 1970s in Colescott's work, we can encounter our old friend, Colonel Saunders, again in this painting, Cafe Ole Ole of 1974. This time he is caught in flagrante delicto with a young Black woman in a short-skirted maid's outfit holding a tray of a cup of coffee, Cafe Ole, with a bottle of Delta Cream, which references a brand of chocolate biscuit with a vanilla cream filling. The images call to mind such pinup imagery, such as that of a topless maid character with a duster, as seen in Gil Evgren's I Gave Him the Brush Off from 1970 on the right. While this image teases the viewer with hints at possibilities, Colescott tends to be more flat-footed, as seen in Cafe Ole Ole, because here the female character is clearly more accommodating than Aunt Jemima, because in the bubble inset, we see a sex scene involving her and the Colonel, who's lying very comfortably and satisfied in the bed in the background. Through the title, Colescott also comments on notions of Black female beauty based on skin color and most likely hair texture, the cruder dynamics of miscegenation that would be considered more attractive because they were mixed race, mestizo, or cafe au lait. This was reinforced recently by an online article that was shared with me by Leslie King Hammond that talked about the $8 billion spent by women of color all over the world on skin bleaching products. For critic Gregory Babcock, the presence of Colonel Saunders in this painting, as well as the trio of 1973 paintings with Aunt Jemima that we discussed previously, reinforces the hypocrisy that for so long colored, if you will, the dynamics of race, socialization, economics, and politics in this country. And I just wanted to do a little side mention here on the subject of Black pinups. We can parenthetically note that Maria Elena Buzak reported that starting in 1945, publisher John H. Johnson, who is the founder of Ebony magazine, employed pinups and centerfolds to cultivate an African-American market for the publication. In addition to well-known actresses and performers such as Lena Horne on the left, Josephine Baker in the center, these glamorized, sexualized imagery of Black women came from a range of backgrounds and professions and were also featured in the companion magazine to Ebony, Jet. The idea was to demythologize white beauty to show that there was no difference if the pinup were Black or white. The attractiveness was the same. As in the case of the pinups co-opted for the war effort, these depictions were accompanied by stories that described the ordinary aspirations of the women as they struggled to face their daily lives. This feature was not without its critics, some who thought it was an overemphasis on light-skinned women, and others who had moral objections, but that is a subject for another lecture. So to conclude this discussion, we can consider two of Andy Warhol's most famous compositions, Marilyn Monroe and Liz. Cecile Whiting notes that Warhol appropriated mass media images of the stars to, quote, unmask the individuals who lay behind the public personas. In each of these instances, we're considering an image of a woman who is a sex symbol created by society, a woman that is everything society wishes her to be. Colescott's 1976 avatar of a beauty queen, which you see on the right, had laid out the workings of the beauty and movie industries in rather graphic terms against a black and white storyboard behind the victorious contestant, who significantly is seen in a white bikini rather than the usual evening gown that is worn at the conclusion of the beauty contest. There, the protagonist is seen again in flagrante delicto with one of the contestant judges. In Moonlighting in Poro, and I'm wondering if he's punning on Provo, Sex on the Slope, we see on the left a wannabe actress who's posing seductively against a drop cloth of a snow-capped mountain scene, while a director who issues instructions through a megaphone. She's dressed in a winter hat, gloves, a scarf, stockings, and red high heels. And the storyline is made clear by the presence of a man in a winter hat, jacket, red gloves, boots, and red polka dot briefs who stands behind her. The nuances of the scene blare out at us in the large scrolls, starlit, at the top of the composition. So in both these paintings, well before the present time, Colescott exposes the workings of the studio system, which became a focal point of the Me Too movement over the last 2 years, which has profoundly impacted public awareness of blatant sexist attitudes that permeate institutions society-wide all over the world. In her study of Colescott's iconic painting, George Washington Carver Crossing the Delaware, Jody Cutler reiterates that Colescott's deployment of advertising, brand identification, commercial commodities, and popular cartooning effectively, quote, pick up on the product-conscious consumer themes of Main Street pop art, end quote. She further notes that his career can be situated with those of, quote, a number of mainstream artists on both coasts who were mining art history for laughs and late pop art gestures that would become associated with postmodernism, who include the San Francisco artist Peter Saul, end quote. And Peter and Colescott were good friends. While political context was not absent from the tortured configurations of Saul's figures or a critique of modern consumerism and media from Warhol's appropriations, Colescott inevitably insinuated, quote, matters of race into the traditionally white mainstream in such blunt form that it could not be quoted, end quote. As we have seen, in doing so, he implicates us all, regardless of race, gender, preference, or whatever. We are all fools in life stage and trapped in our own obsessions and prejudices. If Michael Lobel asserts pop's customary distance and neutrality may also function as a refusal of difference, racial and otherwise, then it was Colescott's steadfast focus on that difference and his determined attempts to celebrate the contributions that difference brings to the course of society that ultimately demonstrates his simultaneous proximity to and distance from pop art. And just very quickly, I'd like to put in a plug for the exhibition Race Matters, the career of Robert Colescott, which I had the privilege of co-curating with Rafaela Plateau, director of the Contemporary Arts Center in Cincinnati, which originated the project, and Matthew Wesley, an independent art historian. It is the first complete survey of his work from the late 1940s until his death. The exhibition tour is resuming after an extended venue at the Portland Museum in Oregon, and will be able to be seen at the Sarasota Art Museum May 29th to October 31st, 2020, and then at the Chicago Cultural Center in Chicago, December 10th, 2021 to March 13th, 2022. Thank you.
Thank you, Lowery. That was great. Really happy to hear that the exhibition's continuing. It's really interesting. So everybody, we'll take some questions now. And so I'll just redirect you. There's the chat button and the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Please do feel free to use them and put in questions. We have a couple already. So I'll get started. There's a question from Nell Painter.
Yes. Hi, Nell.
I've always associated Colescott's use of tablecloth checkerboard pattern with his time in Paris, but does it reference Aunt Jemima's dress?
No, I think you're probably right. I mean, the checkerboard, appears in, compositions all throughout his career. And he had such a love of Paris. I think that is, totally appropriate, because we all know those checkerboard, tablecloths in Paris cafes that we hope that we'll be able to get back to soon. So I think that's a great observation, Nell. Thank you.
There's an anonymous question. Do you see a connection between Colescott and Kehinde Wiley?
No. Look, Colescott is, even as his work changes, I mean, mostly we were looking at the 70s, early 80s works. As he gets into the 80s and the 90s, he gets, extraordinarily involved in complicated compositions that sort of really talk about the dynamics of, if we go back to old encounters among Europe, America, Asia, and Pacific, and all the issues of colonization, lost histories and things. He still is sort of using that sort of very extraordinarily painterly technique of his. And in some of the large paintings, where he has great, expanses, like he has huge heads, you can sort of really see how he's scumbling in the color. Kehinde, and I had the fun of being the director of the Studio Museum when Kehinde was the AIR, one of the AIRs that year. And so I spent a lot of time with him in his studio. And Kehinde's really about, he's using art history in a similar way to Colescott. But I think that Kehinde's work is more specifically heroic in intent, and really sort of using art history as a kind of venue to put in people who you might dismiss or ignore. And of course, because they are, inevitably African-American in a composition that would be familiar to us with white characters. That's maybe the connection with Colescott. But Colescott always has a satirical edge that I think is not part of Kehinde's strategy.
Lisa Davis is asking, it seems the way he steps away from pop art is his composition. Can you speak more about how you see the complexity of his compositions?
Well, I think the complexity lies in the our sort of in sort of our ability to mind the interpretations. He gives us clues along the way, you know, particularly in these early paintings. He has all these stencils, um, references and asides and things like that. And I think that part of the complexity is our willingness to sort of understand how he is laying bare some of the sort of more difficult issues around imagery, how we view people of different cultures and different complexities. Always done so that it makes you laugh. But then when you think about it, you know, he sort of caught you, you know, in that laugh. So that it's not necessarily like this kind of boom, hi, you're a racist, you know, because you think this, this, and this. He says, I know you think this, and this, and I'm going to put it here, and I'm going to deconstruct it in a way that makes you think about what the implications of your racist attitudes are. And once you figure it out, you're gone in too far for you to sort of get out unscathed. In the catalog for the Cincinnati show, I reproduced a wonderful essay that Mitchell Kahan did for the 1987 survey of Colescott's work that was organized by John Albrance and Mimi Roberts at San Jose. And I traveled all around the country. And Mitchell talked about, you know, he's sort of grew up in the South, and he was standing in front of, I think it was Just Folks, which is Colescott's takeoff on the Vermeer of the Woman with a Picture. And he just, you know, he's an art historian, a white Southerner, and he just sort of, you know, like, and he said he grew up, you know, like sort of being taken care of by Black women. And when he saw it, he laughed, you know, because he understood what was happening with our reading of the art historical work, and at the same time, this kind of elevation, you know, like of Black people who would not have been seen in the higher, you know, like sort of echelons of art history. So he's laughing, and he turns to sort of share this joke with someone standing next to him. And it's a Black woman who's not really all that, you know, amused. So one of the challenges, you know, like we always have with Colescott's work is whether or not people are willing to sort of engage the irony and the satire and the parody and laugh both at oneself and also to laugh at what the situation is. And then see where that laughter takes you, you know, as you go on. It's a real challenge with his work. And I kind of liked it for that reason.
Here's a timely question from Catherine Whiting. She says, amazing discussion. Thank you so much. Colescott's work has been described as giving a 1-2 punch.
Oh, yeah.
When you experience it in person. I would love to know, what was your first experience in front of a Colescott?
It was a 1-2 punch. I was just getting started as a curator at the Metropolitan Museum. I'd been hired by Henry Gelzeller, who was then the curator. And uncharacteristically, Henry came into my office one day and said, come on, we're going to grab a cab. I want to take you down to see an exhibition. And I think it was an exhibition at Semaphore, and it was about 1979-ish. And 78, 79-ish. And I walked in, you know, to sort of see this work. And I just couldn't believe it. It was like, this guy's Black? You know, it was just, and in a sense, you know, maybe because I have a perverse streak, I really loved it. It was kind of a relief to me as a woman at that point in her 30s, who was caught between a kind of Black bourgeois expectations of what my behavior should be, and also a kind of Black nationalist, expectation of what my behavior should be, neither of which I really wanted to sort of fully accept. I wanted to accept parts of different things. And so when I walked in and saw this person who had I thought it was the guts, just to sort of put out all these taboos and, things that you never say or show, I just adored it. And I took a lot of flack, over the years from other artists and people for my fidelity to Colescott. But I think in the end, Colescott is a liberator in many senses, but it's not the kind of liberator that you think. It's not going to be, one standing at a pulpit with sonorous tones going at what it is. He's a liberator in sort of making you, forcing you deal with issues and ideas that you find uncomfortable. And sometimes reconciling those is the ultimate liberation, I think. That's my personal opinion.
Amy Brown Price asked, or she says, thanks so much. Could you give some idea of the dimensions of the works? Do they vary?
Oh, I know. I'm really bad about the dimensions. Mostly the paintings are 72 by 84. That was sort of like his, a few inches off here and there. And larger paintings could be 84 by 109, but that seems to have been like the size that he favored generally for most of his career.
Another anonymous question is, do you think R. Crumb was influenced by Colescott?
It's a good question. But I would have said it was the other way around, because R. Crumb, Colescott spent a period of time in Egypt in the 60s, from like 63 to about 66, 67. And there's a period where he's in France, like he sort of is teaching at the American University, and then the Israeli and Egyptian war breaks out, and then he has to go to Europe. He goes through Italy and then France, and then he and his second wife, sort of have a school for a minute, and then he comes to New York. And I think that Matthew Wesley, who is really sort of involved in this sort of like the machinations of this period of work than I am. The question we have is, how does he get from a group of paintings known as the Valley Queen paintings, which are essentially these sort of like swaths of color with individual figural elements. And you can sort of see them starting, 68, 69, coalescing, like the image that we used to illustrate to advertise the lecture. But by 1970, I guess he's back in, like San Francisco. But I think R. Crumb was sort of doing that. But if you look at Colescott's work in the larger sort of Bay Area figuration, like you have sort of like other renegade people like Joan Brown, who's doing her own kind of figuration. I came across an exhibition once at Lenin Weinberg of H.C. Westerman's drawings done in 1977. And, like you just sort of sit there and go, yo, Colescott, just in terms of the way the figures are done, the sensibility, the narratives and everything. So it was a kind of thing going around. I never had a chance to sort of ask him if he actually was looking at R. Crumb, but it certainly is part of what we would call Bay Area figuration funk. So that it was sort of like a sensibility that was in the air.
Karen Wilkin is asking, do you see Henry Taylor as responding to Colescott in some way?
I think that there are a number of artists working today that can be said to be cotangent with Colescott in their engagement of contemporary issues, you know. But I don't know if I'd have to sort of think a little bit more about that. I don't think of Henry Taylor and Colescott in the same cohort, but you never know. I mean, all the stuff is around here. And Henry, you know, like does have a very expressionist, painterly style, but he's not as insistent on like the narrative, the way that Colescott is, in my mind. I'll have to think about that a little bit more. I'll get back to you on that, Karen.
Here's a comment from Nell Painter. You're exactly right about the frequent reluctance to enter into Colescott's satire. When I headed Princeton's African American Studies program, not yet a department, I put up George Washington crossing the Delaware, which I thought hilarious, but the poster kept being put behind the couch. So the students didn't share my or Colescott's sense of humor in the late 1990s.
No, I mean, when we were preparing the exhibition, particularly that period, like say between 1972 and 76 to 77, there's a lot of outrageous, Colescotts. I mean, Mom's, old-fashioned root beer is just the beginning, and we were doing a charrette that was for the exhibition. The Warhol Foundation had given us a research grant. So we had these convenings of people who knew Colescott, influenced by Colescott, taught by Colescott in Portland, San Francisco, and then we were ending up in Tucson, which was where he finished out, his career and his life. And I was trying to sort of like, like deal with these kinds of issues with the group. And one of the participants was a student of Colescott's, and he brought one of his students who was like a young Black woman in her 20s. And we were looking at some images, and I kind of looked over and I said, Zoe, how do you feel about that? She went, it makes me very uncomfortable. And I think that there is a way, like that, like I tried to say, that some of the bawdiness about it, like is very much, like time specific, and you'd have to be maybe of a certain generation to sort of totally get it. Although some young people do, but I think on the face of it, like there is that kind of generational, like aspect to it. And one of the things I had to decide ultimately in sort of picking and choosing, paintings from that period was whether or not it would advance the story we wanted to tell about Colescott, whether it would be disruptive. I didn't want to have one sensational image, being, seized by the internet and just torpedoing any other, conversation you could have about his work. But now, my story with that particular painting is that my mother came to visit me at the Metropolitan Museum when I was there, and she bought, and I was having dinner with two friends. And my mother was, she always tried to pretend she was all that conservative, but she wasn't. And so she, we came down, we met in the restaurant, and I bought a copy of the 1984 art forum that had George Washington Carver on the cover. And, and so as we sat down, my friend, in his inimitable way, said, Larry, I never noticed that guy giving that woman giving that guy a blowjob until you mentioned it in your article. And my mother looks at the magazine. Blowjob, and after that dinner, she didn't speak to me for about a month, So, yeah, it's tough carrying the Colescott standard. for sure.
I mean, it's my own reaction. It's interesting to think of what you just said, and like the Kent Monkman.
Oh yes, yes,
up in the net right now, which are much more digestible. I mean,
well, except the one he did. What did he call it? The one with Trudeau. I'm forgetting the. I talked about it in my class, my last year. Hanky Panky. Yeah. Yeah. Ken sort of pushes the envelope the way that Colescott does.
Yeah. Here's a question from Julian Otis. Could you speak a little more about that generational divide? Asking a young artist who doesn't feel uncomfortable, asking as a young artist who doesn't feel uncomfortable when looking at Robert Colescott's work.
Well, I think it depends on how you want to. I'm sort of making a sort of blanket statement about a generational divide. If you're young and you're comfortable with it, it's okay. I mean, look, I like Robert Colescott, but I see things that Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion do, that sort of like, give me pause, So I think a lot of it is also what your particular individual tolerance and appreciation is about. I don't want to make a general thing saying that all young people are prudes, because I think there's plenty of sexual content in contemporary culture, particularly in hip hop videos and things like that. So I think it's whatever makes your boat float is where you go. But I think that if you really appreciate Colescott, appreciate his really intelligent approach to satire and his incredible deconstructions of history and art history.
Okay. I guess we might have one more, unless if anyone else wants to put in their question. This comes from M.A. Brown Price again. She says, you mentioned 2 self-portraits interjected into the larger compositions. Are there many others? As a voyeur, she's asking, other self-portraits not within larger compositions?
Oh yeah, there are a bunch. There's one in the Portland Museum's collection called "A Beauty in the Eyes of the Beholder." Where he's done a couple of compositions of him as the artist in the studio. Where he's in the studio and he's got a reproduction of Matisse's dance in the background, and then there's a woman model sort of disrobing, for him. And in a 1984 painting that's part of a whole series of paintings he did on the theme of the bathers and sort of the judgment of Paris. It's called The Large Bathers. I think it's in the collection of the Delaware Museum. And he has 4 women in a sort of, wading pool, primping, different colors, different hair textures and colors. And he's laying down prone, nude, with a golden apple on the side. And he's sort of reenacting the role of Paris in the Judgment of Paris. So I often show that with one of the versions by Lucas Cranach from, I think, 1528. And I think it's in the Metz collection, where Paris seems to be slouched down, in front of all this pulchritude. So yeah, his portraitures, he does, occasionally, judicious self-portrait, just to sort of implicate himself in the thing. He's not necessarily somebody who's standing, aside and out here looking at things. He's really, saying, I'm in this too.
Well, I think, well, I have one. Karen Wilkins says, terrific talk, Lowery. And she feels so lucky that she had the chance to see the show in Cincinnati. Your mention of satire was key. He's so brilliantly acidic. And there's some other thank yous coming in. Shawnee Turner.
Oh, hi, Shawnee. Hi.
She says, thank you, Lowery. It's always a pleasure to hear you talk. And yeah, I second that. This was just a wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank you for taking your time out of your busy schedule to give it for the New York Studio School. And I will let you have the last word. But you know, I hope we have the chance to see you in New York at the Studio School in person sometime soon. But you know,
I think that's, yeah, I think, Sam, that's the wish that we all have.
Yeah.
Be able to see each other in person soon,
Yes.
rather than a little screen on Zoom.
Yeah.
So thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you for the great questions. And thank you for your interest in Bob Colescott.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.